At 18, Nolan Mercer had $43, a duffel bag, and nobody in the world expecting him to survive. 3 weeks after aging out of foster care, he wandered into a town called Cedar Ridge and spent his last $10 on something nobody else wanted, an abandoned fire station that looked ready to collapse. The roof leaked. The windows were shattered. The town had forgotten it. But hidden behind 6 rusted lockers bolted to a wall that didn't belong there was a sealed steel door. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide what was behind it. Inside waited a secret room, untouched for years, a collection of journals, a forgotten fortune, and answers to questions Nolan had spent his entire life asking. Questions about who he was, where he came from, and why an entire town had unknowingly been waiting 18 years for him to come home. The social worker kept pushing the tissue box toward him. Nolan never touched it. He sat across from her desk in a plastic chair that wobbled every time he shifted his weight. Behind her, fluorescent lights hummed softly against the ceiling tiles. A clock ticked somewhere in the room. Everything felt strangely ordinary for a day that was supposed to change his life. "Nolan," the woman said carefully, "do you have any questions before we finish the paperwork?" He looked down at the thin manila folder resting on the desk. That folder contained 18 years of his life. 18 years reduced to a stack of papers less than an inch thick. "That's all?" he asked. The woman hesitated. "It's everything we have." Nolan opened the folder. A birth certificate, a few intake reports, medical records, placement transfers. Nothing more. No family history, no photographs of smiling parents, no letters, no explanations, just facts. Cold facts. The birth certificate listed a mother named Vivian Mercer. The father's line was blank. Deceased. That was all it said. The next document showed the date he entered state care at 6 months old. No relatives located. No emergency contacts. No next of kin. Nolan flipped through the pages one by one. 7 foster homes. 5 schools. 3 group facilities. Dozens of case numbers. Every page seemed to tell the same story. Nobody stayed. Nobody came back. Nobody claimed him. The social worker slid an envelope across the desk. "Your remaining allowance balance." Nolan opened it. $43. The final financial summary of his childhood. He almost laughed. Instead, he folded the money and put it in his wallet. Inside the wallet was the only photograph he owned. A faded picture of himself as a toddler sitting on a kitchen floor. No date, no location, no explanation. Just proof that once, long ago, somebody had pointed a camera in his direction. He slipped the photograph back into place and stood. The social worker looked uncomfortable. "Do you have somewhere to go?" "Yeah." The lie came easily, because the truth sounded worse. No, he didn't have anywhere. 20 minutes later, he walked out of the building carrying everything he owned in a single duffel bag. The spring air felt colder than it should have. For the first week, he slept behind shopping centers and abandoned storage units. For the second week, he learned which gas stations stayed open all night and which public restrooms had electrical outlets. By the third week, hunger became part of his routine. He stopped checking his reflection, stopped caring what day it was, stopped thinking further ahead than the next meal. One afternoon, a truck driver heading west offered him a ride. Nolan climbed into the passenger seat without asking where they were going. Anything was better than standing still. Hours later, the truck dropped him at a crossroads beside a town he had never heard of. Cedar Ridge, population 4,112. The sign stood crooked beside the road. Nolan adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and started walking. He passed a diner, a hardware store, a courthouse, and then he saw the flyer pinned to a public bulletin board. County tax auction Saturday. 10 a.m. 12 properties available. Nolan was about to walk away when one line caught his attention. Former firehouse number 7. Minimum bid, 10. He stopped. Then he read the line again. $10 for an entire building. And for the first time in weeks, something felt different. Not hope. Not exactly. But curiosity. And sometimes curiosity was enough to keep a person moving. Nolan stared at the flyer for a long moment. Then he folded the corner of the paper down and memorized the address. Nolan spent Friday night beneath the awning of a closed gas station on the edge of Cedar Ridge. Sleep never really came. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself thinking about the fire station. $10. The number kept repeating in his head. $10 was almost a quarter of everything he had left. $10 could buy food for several days. $10 could mean the difference between getting through the week and going hungry. Buying a condemned building with it was probably the dumbest decision he could make. Yet, when morning arrived, he found himself walking toward the courthouse anyway. The auction had already started when he arrived. Rows of folding chairs covered the courthouse lawn. Local residents sat comfortably among neighbors they had known for years. Property descriptions echoed through a portable speaker while a county employee read from a clipboard. Nolan stood near the back and watched. Vacant lots sold first, then an abandoned house, then a small storage building. People bid casually, confidently, like spending money was no more difficult than ordering lunch. Nolan shoved his hands into his pockets and listened. He felt completely out of place. The fire station came up last. The woman with the clipboard cleared her throat. Property number 12, former Cedar Ridge Firehouse number 7, single-story brick structure, approximately 4,000 square feet, decommissioned in 2018. Significant structural deterioration noted. Minimum opening bid $10. Silence. Nobody moved. A few people exchanged glances. Someone laughed quietly. The woman waited. "Do I have $10? Still nothing. Nolan looked around. Not a single hand rose. It was obvious the townspeople knew something he didn't. Maybe the building was dangerous. Maybe it was beyond repair. Maybe it was cursed. For a brief moment he considered walking away. Then he remembered sleeping in parks, remembered washing his clothes in gas station sinks, remembered having nowhere to go when the auction ended. Slowly he raised his hand. The woman looked surprised. Several people turned around. Nolan suddenly became the most interesting thing at the auction. "I have $10, he said. The crowd remained silent. "Any bids above 10? Nothing. The woman waited another few seconds. Going once? No response. Going twice? Still nothing. Sold. The gavel struck. Just like that, the building belonged to him. Nobody applauded. Nobody congratulated him. Most people simply stared. One older woman actually looked sorry for him. Inside the courthouse, Nolan signed several forms he barely understood. The county clerk slid a key across the counter. "You sure about this?" she asked. Nolan looked down at the old brass key. "No." To his surprise, the clerk smiled. That's probably the honest answer. 20 minutes later, he stood outside Firehouse number 7. The building sat 3 blocks from Main Street. The brick walls were stained with years of weather. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete apron. 2 massive bay doors stood half open, rust frozen along the tracks. The station looked abandoned, forgotten, almost sad. Nolan approached slowly. The brass key fit the side entrance. The lock clicked. The door groaned inward. Dust drifted through sunlight pouring from broken windows. The smell of mildew and old wood filled the air. Inside, the station was worse than he expected. Broken glass covered the floor. Ceiling tiles hung loose overhead. Water stains stretched across entire walls. But beneath the damage, something caught his attention. The steel support beams were solid. The brickwork remained strong. The foundation looked level. The building wasn't dead. It was simply neglected. For the first time, Nolan felt something unexpected. Possibility. He spent the afternoon clearing a small corner of the truck bay. Broken glass, rotten debris, pieces of fallen ceiling. By sunset, he had created a clean patch of concrete large enough for his sleeping bag. That night, he lay beneath the old station roof. Wind whispered through broken windows. The building creaked softly around him. Yet somehow, it felt safer than anywhere he had slept in weeks. Before closing his eyes, Nolan looked up at the dark ceiling. This place might be falling apart, but for now, it was his. The next morning, sunlight poured through the east windows and illuminated the rear hallway of the station. And at the very back of the building, beyond the bunk room, Nolan noticed something that immediately made him stop. A row of 6 rusted steel lockers stood bolted against a wall that didn't match the rest of the station. Nolan stood motionless in the back room of the station. Something about the wall bothered him. At first, he couldn't explain why. Then, he saw it. Every other wall inside Firehouse Number 7 was built from old red brick. The same brick appeared outside the building, in the truck bay, and throughout the hallway. But the wall behind the lockers was different. Gray cinder blocks, different mortar, different construction. It didn't belong. Nolan stepped closer. Dust coated the lockers from top to bottom. The red paint had faded long ago, leaving patches of rust beneath the metal surface. He ran his fingers along the edge of the wall. The seam was visible. Someone had built this section later, years later, maybe decades. The question was, why? He knocked on the cinder block with his knuckles. Solid. He moved farther left and knocked again. This time, the sound changed. A hollow echo answered from somewhere beyond the wall. Nolan froze. Then he knocked again. The hollow sound returned. His pulse quickened. There was empty space behind it. He crouched near the floor and examined the base of the lockers. A narrow gap separated the wall from the concrete. When he placed his hand near it, he felt something unexpected. Air, cool air, flowing steadily from the other side. A room. There had to be a room back there. Someone had hidden it, and then hidden it again behind 6 enormous steel lockers. Nolan grabbed the nearest locker and pulled. Nothing happened. The lockers didn't budge. He pulled harder. Still nothing. Looking closer, he discovered why. The lockers had been bolted directly into the concrete floor. Whoever installed them never intended them to be moved. Nolan sat back on his heels. For several minutes, he simply stared. He had discovered something important. He could feel it. But without tools, he wasn't getting through. An hour later, he crossed Main Street and entered the hardware store he had passed the day before. A brass bell rang above the door. The store smelled like wood, paint, and machine oil. Rows of tools stretched toward the back wall. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, reading a newspaper. The man looked up. "Help you?" "I need a socket wrench," Nolan said. The man folded the newspaper. "What are you working on?" "The old fire station." The man's eyebrows lifted. "You're the kid who bought it?" "Guess so." The man studied him for a moment. Nolan was used to that look. People often tried to figure out where he belonged. Most never found an answer. Finally, the man walked around the counter. "Come on." He led Nolan down an aisle and pulled a red toolbox from a shelf. "This will do the job." Nolan checked the price tag. $24. His stomach sank. "I only have 8. The man glanced toward the station through the front window, then back at Nolan. Without another word, he handed over the toolbox. "Bring it back when you're finished." Nolan blinked. "What?" "You heard me. I can't afford—" "I didn't say buy it." The man extended his hand. "Samuel Whitlock." Nolan shook it. "Nolan Mercer." Samuel nodded. Then he reached into a small refrigerator behind the counter and pulled out a paper bag. "Take this too." Nolan looked inside. A sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Nobody had handed him food for free in a very long time. "Thank you," Samuel shrugged. "Just bring back my tools." Back at the station, Nolan ate the sandwich sitting on the concrete apron outside. Then he got to work. The bolts fought him every step of the way. Rust clung to every thread. Several refused to move at all. But Nolan had learned persistence long before he learned confidence. Hour after hour he worked. One locker, then another, then another. By late afternoon, sweat soaked through his shirt. His hands were raw. But the final locker finally scraped across the floor. Metal shrieked against concrete. The entire wall stood exposed. And there, directly in the center, hidden for years behind 6 steel lockers, was a heavy red steel door. Faded white letters stretched across the surface. Chief Nolan stared at it. The old brass key from the auction didn't fit. The door was locked. But after everything he had already uncovered, there was no chance he was walking away. He slid the pry bar into the gap beside the frame and leaned his weight against it. The old metal groaned. The lock resisted. Then suddenly, crack! The bolt snapped. The door swung inward. Cold air rushed out from the darkness beyond. Nolan tightened his grip on the flashlight. Then he stepped through the doorway and immediately realized someone had been waiting for him. Nolan stepped through the doorway and stopped. The room beyond looked untouched by time. Dust floated through the beam of his flashlight, but otherwise everything appeared exactly as it had been left years ago. A large metal desk stood against the far wall. 2 filing cabinets flanked it. A rolling office chair sat slightly pushed back as though someone had stood up in the middle of a task and never returned. The air smelled of old paper and leather. Nolan slowly lowered the flashlight. Unlike the rest of the station, this room showed no water damage, no mold, no collapsed ceiling. Whoever sealed it had protected it carefully. His eyes moved across the walls. Photographs covered nearly every surface. Group pictures of firefighters, award ceremonies, training exercises, community events. Dozens of faces stared back at him from different decades. Beneath many photographs were small brass plaques engraved with names and years of service. This wasn't just an office. It was a record of an entire community. Nolan approached the desk. A thick leather journal rested in the center. The cover had faded with age. He carefully opened it. The first page carried a handwritten name, Walter Ashford, Fire Chief. The writing was neat and deliberate. Nolan turned the page. At first, the entries seemed ordinary. Equipment inspections, maintenance schedules, volunteer training notes, community events. But after several pages, he noticed something unusual. Certain entries had small stars drawn beside them. Those entries were different. January 12, $300 provided to the Miller family after house fire. March 4, emergency assistance for medical treatment. July 17, college tuition support approved. Each entry listed names, dates, dollar amounts, and one recurring phrase, community fund. Nolan continued reading. Page after page documented families receiving help. Some assistance was small, others were significant, but one thing remained consistent. No credit was ever given. The fund operated quietly, anonymously, for years. The deeper Nolan read, the more he realized this wasn't simply a financial record. It was the hidden history of Cedar Ridge. Numbers of people had been helped, hundreds, and almost nobody knew where the support came from. He turned another page, then another. Hours passed without him noticing. Outside, afternoon sunlight shifted through the small office window. Walter's handwriting gradually changed. The entries became more personal, more reflective, more emotional. Names began appearing repeatedly. One name especially, Ethan Mercer. Nolan frowned. Mercer, the same last name printed on his birth certificate. He leaned closer. Walter described Ethan as one of the finest volunteers the station had ever seen. A carpenter by trade. Dependable, fearless. The kind of person who showed up before anyone asked. Another name appeared soon after. Vivian Mercer. Walter wrote about her with equal admiration. A nurse, a medic. Calm under pressure. Trusted by everyone. Nolan felt a strange sensation in his chest. The names meant nothing, at least they shouldn't have, yet he couldn't stop reading. Several pages later, Walter described a devastating school fire, a tragedy that had changed the town forever. The details were brief, the emotions were not. The handwriting grew heavier, as if the chief had pressed harder against the paper while writing. Then Nolan reached an entry dated years later. Walter was no longer writing about firefighters. He was writing about a search, phone calls, government agencies, private investigators, returned letters, dead ends. Every page carried the same frustration. Walter was looking for someone, desperately. The final journal entry occupied an entire page. The writing appeared slower than the others, more deliberate, as though Walter understood it might be his last. Nolan read each line carefully. I've done everything I can. The station is safe. The records are safe. The truth is safe. If the boy ever comes looking, everything is here. Nolan stared at the sentence. The boy. Who was he? Walter never explained. The journal ended there. No final answer. No explanation, only questions. Outside, darkness had begun settling over Cedar Ridge. Nolan closed the journal and leaned back in the chair. The office suddenly felt different, less like a forgotten room, more like a message intended for someone Walter Ashford had spent years searching for. Nolan's eyes drifted toward the filing cabinets beside the desk. If answers existed, they were probably still here. Waiting. He stood, crossed the room, and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were hundreds of carefully organized files, and somewhere among them, he had the growing feeling that he was about to discover why Walter Ashford had spent years looking for a missing boy. The filing cabinet drawers slid open with a metallic scrape. Nolan spent the next hour sorting through folders, insurance documents, training records, equipment inventories, volunteer applications. Everything inside the office had been organized with remarkable care. Walter Ashford had been the kind of man who labeled everything, every folder, every document, every year. The deeper Nolan searched, the stronger his feeling became. Walter hadn't hidden this office to conceal something. He had hidden it to preserve something. The question was what? He moved to the second filing cabinet. More records, tax documents, building permits, correspondence with county officials. Near the bottom drawer, behind a stack of old paperwork, something caught his eye. A manila folder. Unlike the others, it wasn't filed alphabetically. It had been tucked behind everything else, almost as if Walter wanted it protected. Nolan pulled it free. His breath stopped. Written across the tab in careful blue ink were 3 words: Mercer family. Urgent. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he carried the folder to the desk. The room felt unnaturally quiet. The old clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, wind brushed against the station windows. Slowly, Nolan opened the folder. 3 items rested inside. The first was a photograph. A newborn baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. A small identification card attached to the bassinet read, Baby Boy Mercer. The date beneath it was 18 years old. Nolan looked at the infant's face. Then he reached into his wallet and removed the faded photograph he had carried all his life. The toddler sitting on the kitchen floor. Different ages, different moments. The same child. His hands began to tremble. He set both photographs side by side. The resemblance was undeniable. The second item was a newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age. Its headline stretched across the page. 2 volunteer firefighters killed saving children in school fire. Below the headline were 2 photographs. A young man, a young woman. Nolan stared at their faces. The article identified them immediately. Ethan Mercer, Vivian Mercer. The same names he had seen throughout Walter's journal. He continued reading. The article described a devastating fire at Riverside Elementary School. 14 children trapped on the 2nd floor. Smoke spreading rapidly. Volunteer firefighters arriving first. 2 of them entering the building repeatedly to rescue students. Every child survived. The firefighters did not. Nolan swallowed hard. Something heavy seemed to settle in his chest. Then his eyes found a sentence near the bottom. The world around him seemed to disappear. Survived by their infant son, Nolan Ethan Mercer, age 6 months. He read the line again, and again, and again. Nolan Ethan Mercer. His name, not similar, not close. Exactly his name. The room suddenly felt smaller. The air felt thinner. His entire life had begun with unanswered questions. Who were his parents? Why had nobody ever told him about them? Where had he come from? Now, 2 photographs on a newspaper page were answering everything at once. He reached for the third item. A larger photograph printed on thick paper. A man and woman stood together in front of Firehouse Number 7. Both wore volunteer turnout gear. The man smiled broadly. The woman rested comfortably against his shoulder. Written on the back was a note in Walter's handwriting. Ethan and Vivian Mercer, Station 7, Spring Fundraiser, 2005. Nolan stared at the image. Then he held it beside his own childhood photograph. The similarities became impossible to ignore. His father's eyes, his mother's jawline. Features he had never understood suddenly had a history, a source, a family. For 18 years he had believed he came from nowhere. Now he knew the truth. He came from heroes. Nolan sat down heavily in Walter's chair. The photographs remained spread across the desk before him. His parents had served in this station, worked in this station, laughed here, planned their future here, and died saving 14 children. Tears threatened for the first time in years. He blinked them away, not because he wasn't grieving, because he didn't yet know how. The office door stood open behind him. The hidden room felt less like a mystery now, more like a bridge connecting him to people he had never met. A bridge Walter Ashford had protected for nearly 2 decades. Hours later, long after darkness had filled the station, Nolan crossed Main Street and entered Samuel Whitlock's hardware store. Samuel looked up immediately. One glance at Nolan's face, and his expression changed. "You found something," he said quietly. Nolan nodded. "Ethan and Vivian Mercer." Samuel froze. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Samuel slowly removed his glasses. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find them." Nolan's heart skipped. "You knew them?" Samuel looked toward the station across the street. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I knew them very well." Then he looked back at Nolan. "And there's someone else you need to meet." The next morning, Samuel Whitlock closed his hardware store for an hour. That alone told Nolan how important this was. As they crossed Main Street together, Samuel remained unusually quiet. They walked 3 blocks east through a neighborhood of small houses shaded by old maple trees. Finally, Samuel stopped in front of a white house surrounded by a weathered chain-link fence. Rose bushes lined the walkway. Some were overgrown. Others still bloomed. A wooden wind chime moved gently on the porch. "This is her place," Samuel said. Nolan looked at the house. "She's expecting me?" Samuel gave a small smile. "No," he paused. "But I think she's been expecting you for 18 years. Before Nolan could ask what that meant, Samuel turned and headed back toward town. Nolan stood alone on the porch. His heart beat harder than it should have. After a moment, he knocked. Nothing happened. He waited. Then he heard slow footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened a few inches. An elderly woman peered through the gap. White hair, wire-rimmed glasses, sharp blue eyes. The moment she saw Nolan, she froze. Her hand tightened around the edge of the door. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then her eyes filled with tears. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. Nolan shifted awkwardly. "Ma'am, my name is—" "I know who you are." The words stopped him. The woman stepped back slightly. "You have Ethan's eyes." Nolan felt a chill run through him. The woman opened the door wider. "Come inside, Nolan." The house smelled faintly of tea and lavender. Photographs covered nearly every wall. Some showed firefighters. Others showed community picnics and holiday gatherings. Many featured a smiling man Nolan immediately recognized from the journal photographs. Walter Ashford. The woman led him to the kitchen. A kettle sat steaming on the stove. She moved carefully but confidently. Age had slowed her body, not her mind. She placed 2 mugs on the table. Then she sat across from him. "My name is Eleanor Ashford." Nolan nodded. "I know." A sad smile touched her face. "Then you've been reading Walter's journals. I found the office." Her eyes closed briefly. "Thank God." The words sounded less like relief and more like the end of a very long wait. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Nolan gathered his courage. "Tell me about them." Eleanor knew exactly who he meant. A gentle smile appeared. "Ethan and Vivian." She looked past Nolan for a moment, as though seeing memories instead of walls. "Ethan was a carpenter, best craftsman in Cedar Ridge." She pointed toward a bookshelf. "He built that." Then toward a cabinet. "And that." A small laugh escaped her. He couldn't walk past something broken without fixing it. Nolan found himself smiling despite everything. "What about Vivian?" The smile deepened. Vivian was a nurse, quiet, calm, stronger than anyone realized. Eleanor folded her hands. If a child was scared, Vivian knew how to comfort them. If someone was hurt, she knew exactly what to do. She paused. The station adored her. For the next hour, Eleanor shared story after story. How Ethan proposed during a charity fundraiser. How Vivian once treated 3 injured people during a highway accident before the ambulance arrived. how the two of them spent weekends repairing playground equipment and helping neighbors. They weren't extraordinary because they were heroes. They were heroes because they never stopped helping people. At last the conversation reached the question Nolan feared most. The fire. Eleanor's smile faded. The kitchen grew quiet. It happened at Riverside Elementary. Nolan listened carefully. 14 children were trapped upstairs. Her voice remained steady. Ethan and Vivian entered the building before backup arrived. Nolan lowered his eyes. They got every child out. Eleanor swallowed. Every single one. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The stairwell collapsed while they were still inside. Silence filled the room. Nolan stared at the table. His parents had saved 14 lives and lost their own. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Eleanor reached across the table and gently touched his hand. Afterward, Walter tried to find you. Nolan looked up. He searched everywhere. She explained the letters, the phone calls, the investigators, the years. He never stopped. Nolan felt his throat tighten. Why? Eleanor's answer came immediately. Because he loved your parents. She squeezed his hand. And because he loved you. Tears shimmered in her eyes now. There was one thing Walter made me promise. Nolan sat forward. Eleanor slowly reached beneath her sweater collar. A thin silver chain emerged. At the end hung a small brass key. She unclasped it carefully. For years, it had rested against her heart. Walter's final instruction. Eleanor placed the key in Nolan's palm. He told me to keep this until the day the boy came home. Nolan stared at the key. The metal felt warm from her skin. What does it open? Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. The last thing Walter left for you. Nolan barely slept that night. The brass key remained in his pocket the entire walk back to Firehouse number 7. Several times he reached down, just to make sure it was still there. By dawn, sunlight was creeping through the broken station windows when he returned to Walter Ashford's hidden office. The room felt different now. Not mysterious, personal. Every photograph on the walls seemed connected to him somehow. Every page in Walter's journals carried pieces of a story that had been waiting 18 years to be completed. Nolan walked behind the desk. Then he saw it. The safe, bolted directly into the concrete floor beneath the desk. Gray steel, heavy, unmovable. He had noticed it before, but never had a way to open it. Now he knelt beside it. The brass key fit perfectly. For a moment, he hesitated. Walter had prepared this moment years ago, long before his death, long before Nolan even knew Cedar Ridge existed. Slowly, he inserted the key. The lock resisted, then turned. A sharp click echoed through the office. The safe door swung open. Inside were 3 items. Nothing more. Nothing less. Each carefully placed, as if Walter had packed them himself and expected them to be discovered someday. The first item was a thick leather document folder. The second was a large manila envelope. The third was a sealed white envelope. Across the front, written in Walter's familiar handwriting, were 2 words. Nolan Mercer. His throat tightened. He carefully removed everything and placed it on the desk. The leather folder came first. Inside was a property deed. Nolan unfolded the document. The date immediately caught his attention. 12 years earlier, Walter Ashford had purchased Firehouse number 7 from the county. Outright. The amount listed on the document was $22,000. Nolan read the page twice, then 3 times. The station had never been abandoned by Walter. He had owned it personally. A handwritten note attached to the final page explained everything. Upon Walter Ashford's death, ownership transferred into a trust administered through the county courthouse. The designated beneficiary was listed clearly. Nolan Ethan Mercer, son of Ethan and Vivian Mercer. Nolan stared at the words. The tax auction. The $10. The entire thing suddenly made sense. He hadn't actually purchased the building. He had paid outstanding property taxes on a building that Walter had already intended for him. The station had belonged to him before he even arrived in Cedar Ridge. A strange laugh escaped his throat. The building really had found him. Just as Eleanor said. Next, he opened the manila envelope. Bank statements spilled across the desk. Trust documents. Contribution records. Account summaries. The paperwork belonged to something called the Walter Ashford Community Trust. Nolan flipped through the pages, then froze. Balance, $327,418.52. His eyes widened. The number couldn't be real. He checked again. $327,000. The account history explained where it came from. Years of donations, community fundraisers, volunteer contributions. Small amounts added steadily over decades. Walter had preserved the money, protected it, and eventually assigned it all to one beneficiary, Nolan. His hands shook as he lowered the documents. For most of his life, $40 had felt like a fortune. Now he was staring at a number large enough to completely change his future. Yet strangely, it wasn't the money that affected him most. It was the reason behind it. People he had never met, firefighters he had never known, citizens who didn't even know his name. They had all contributed because of his parents, because of the sacrifices Ethan and Vivian had made. Nolan swallowed hard and reached for the final envelope. Walter's letter. The paper crackled softly as he opened it. The handwriting inside was slower than the journal entries, more deliberate. Walter had clearly taken his time. Nolan began reading. Dear Nolan, I do not know how old you will be when you read this. I only know that I hope you find it. For a moment, Nolan stopped, then continued. Your parents were two of the finest people I have ever known. Ethan Mercer was brave without needing attention. Vivian Mercer was kind without expecting thanks. Together they served this town because helping people mattered to them. They loved this station. They loved Cedar Ridge. And they loved you. Nolan's vision blurred. He blinked several times and kept reading. Walter described Ethan painting a nursery yellow before Nolan was born. Vivian bringing him to training drills in a car seat. Firefighters taking turns holding him while meetings took place. Stories. Memories. Proof that he had once been surrounded by people who cared. Then came Walter's final words. If you are reading this, then I failed to find you. For that, I am sorry. But I hope this station succeeds where I could not. Everything here belongs to you now. The building, the fund, the responsibility. Use them wisely. Help people. Protect this place. And become the kind of man your parents would recognize immediately. Nolan lowered the letter. Silence filled the office. He sat there for a long time. The deed, the trust, the letter, a lifetime of answers resting on a desk. At last he folded the pages carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. Outside, the sound of tires crunching across the station's concrete apron suddenly broke the silence. A vehicle had arrived. Nolan walked to the office window. A black SUV had stopped near the bay doors. A well-dressed man stepped out, silver hair, expensive suit, confident posture. The man looked at the station with the expression of someone examining property rather than history. Then he looked directly at Nolan and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who wanted something he believed could be bought. The man crossed the cracked concrete apron with practiced confidence. Everything about him suggested success. The tailored suit, the polished shoes, the expensive watch visible beneath his cuff. He stopped a few feet from Nolan and extended a hand. Gavin Thornton. Nolan shook it. The grip was firm, controlled. The kind of handshake used during negotiations, not friendships. I own Thornton Development. Nolan nodded. He had never heard of it. Gavin glanced toward the station. I've been trying to acquire this property for years. The statement immediately put Nolan on guard. Why? Gavin looked around. The location. His hand swept toward the surrounding block. Main Street access, corner lot, good visibility. He smiled slightly. Perfect for redevelopment. Nolan already knew where the conversation was heading. It's not for sale. Gavin's smile remained. You haven't even heard my offer. I don't need to. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Gavin reached into his jacket and removed a business card. I'll make this simple. He handed it over. $5,000. Nolan stared at him. What? Cash. Gavin shrugged. You paid $10 for the place. $5,000 is a pretty good return. A week earlier, Nolan would have accepted immediately. $5,000 would have seemed impossible. Now, everything was different. The station wasn't just a building. It was his parents' station. Walter's station. His station. No. Gavin's smile finally faded. You should think carefully. I already have. Silence settled between them. The developer studied Nolan, trying to understand him, trying to find weakness. Finally, Gavin spoke again. The tax auction may not hold up. Nolan felt his stomach tighten. What does that mean? It means my attorneys are reviewing the sale. Gavin slipped his hands into his pockets. There may be issues with the title. Nolan thought of the deed sitting inside Walter's office, the trust documents, the bank records, the letter. For the first time since discovering them, he felt grateful for Walter's careful planning. The title is fine. Maybe. Gavin's tone suggested otherwise. Then he turned and walked back toward his SUV. At the driver's door he paused. If you change your mind, call me. The vehicle disappeared down Main Street moments later. Nolan stood watching until it vanished. Then he returned to the hidden office. The leather document folder remained on the desk. The deed. The trust. Walter's letter. Proof. Every piece of it. Over the next several days, Nolan focused on cleaning the station. He repaired broken shelving, cleared debris from the truck bay, organized the office. At the same time, he began reading through more of Walter's records. Thousands of pages filled the filing cabinets. One afternoon, he discovered a separate ledger. Unlike the community fund records, these pages tracked contributors. Every firefighter, every volunteer, every donor. The names stretched back decades. Nolan turned page after page, then stopped. Thornton. The name appeared repeatedly. Benjamin Thornton. Monthly contributions, year after year, $20, $50, $100, consistent, reliable. The entries continued for decades. Nolan frowned. Benjamin Thornton, the same last name as Gavin. He continued reading. Near the back of the ledger he found another notation. College tuition assistance recipient, Gavin Thornton, approved by Chief Walter Ashford. Community fund contribution. Nolan blinked. Then read it again. Walter's fund had paid for part of Gavin Thornton's education. The developer trying to destroy the station had once benefited from the very community it represented. The irony was almost unbelievable. The following week, Gavin returned. This time he wasn't alone. A lawyer stepped out beside him carrying a briefcase. Nolan wasn't surprised. He had expected something like this. The lawyer introduced himself and immediately began discussing title disputes and property reviews. Nolan listened quietly. Then he walked inside. A few minutes later he returned, carrying Walter's deed and trust documents. The lawyer examined them carefully, page by page, line by line. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally he closed the folder. His expression had changed completely. The deed is valid. Gavin frowned. What? The ownership transfer is valid. The lawyer tapped the paperwork. The property belonged to Walter Ashford. He looked directly at Gavin. Your claim has no legal basis. For the first time since arriving, Gavin seemed genuinely unsettled. Nolan opened the ledger and placed it on the hood of the SUV. Take a look. Gavin glanced down. His eyes narrowed, then widened. Benjamin Thornton, his father, page after page of donations, years of service, years of contributions. Nolan turned to the tuition record. Walter's handwritten approval sat at the bottom. Gavin stared silently. The color slowly drained from his face. He never told me. Nolan nodded. That's how Walter did things. The lawyer quietly returned to his car. The conversation no longer required legal advice. It required reflection. Several minutes passed. Neither man spoke. Finally, Gavin sat on the station steps. For the first time, he looked less like a developer and more like a son. My father died when I was 19. Nolan listened. I left Cedar Ridge after that. Gavin looked at the station. I spent years trying not to remember this place. His voice softened. I thought replacing it would help. The afternoon sun reflected from the station windows. For a long moment, Gavin simply stared at the building, at the history embedded within its walls. at the legacy his father had helped create. Then he looked at Nolan. The hostility was gone. Only curiosity remained. "What are you going to do with this place?" Nolan looked back at Firehouse Number 7, at the open bay doors, at Walter's office hidden in the rear, at everything he had discovered. And for the first time, he had an answer. "I'm going to fix it." The next morning, Nolan started with a broom. It wasn't much. Just a worn push broom borrowed from Samuel Whitlock's hardware store. But every restoration had to begin somewhere. Dust disappeared first. Then broken glass. Then piles of debris that had been sitting untouched for years. Day by day, Firehouse Number 7 slowly began to change. The transformation wasn't dramatic, not at first. Most people driving past probably wouldn't have noticed, but Nolan noticed. Every cleared corner felt like progress. Every repaired board felt like purpose. For the first time in his life, he wasn't simply surviving. He was building something. Samuel became a regular presence at the station. Every morning before opening the hardware store, he crossed the street carrying coffee and tools. He taught Nolan how to replace damaged framing, how to repair drywall, how to install insulation, how to measure twice and cut once. The lessons extended beyond construction. Samuel rarely offered advice directly. Instead, he told stories. Stories about Ethan Mercer. Stories about Walter Ashford. Stories about people who had spent their lives helping others without expecting recognition. "You know," Samuel said one morning while checking a wall for level, "your father would have hated this." Nolan looked up. "Hated what?" "This crooked framing." Samuel laughed. He would have torn it out and started over. For the first time, Nolan laughed too. The idea that he was unknowingly making the same mistakes his father once made felt strangely comforting. A few weeks later, Eleanor Ashford visited the station. She arrived carrying a small basket of muffins. Then she spent nearly an hour wandering through the building, touching walls, looking at photographs, remembering. When she reached the back of the station, Nolan showed her a small room he had been renovating. Fresh drywall, a new window, simple cabinets, a small bathroom. Nothing fancy, just comfortable. Eleanor looked around quietly. Then she turned toward him. "What is this?" "A place for you." She blinked. Nolan smiled. "You shouldn't be living alone." For a moment she couldn't speak. Then tears filled her eyes. "Harold would have liked that." "Is that a yes?" Eleanor laughed softly. "That's a very enthusiastic yes." She moved in 2 weeks later. Soon curtains appeared in the window. Books lined the shelves. A kettle occupied the kitchenette. For the first time in years, the station felt lived in. Meanwhile, Nolan began using a small portion of the trust fund carefully. He purchased a laptop, enrolled in community college classes online, business management, construction science, structural engineering. Every morning he studied before beginning work. Every evening he read Walter's journals. The more he learned, the more he realized Walter had left him more than money. He had left him responsibility. One night, while reviewing old records in the hidden office, Nolan found additional ledgers he had overlooked. Entire books filled with names, families, dates, emergency assistance, mortgage payments, medical bills, scholarships, 40 years of community support. Page after page documented lives quietly changed by Walter's fund. Nolan sat in silence for a long time. Then an idea formed. The next week, he visited an attorney. A few days later, paperwork was filed. The Walter Ashford Community Fund officially reopened. Its mission remained exactly as Walter intended, helping people without fanfare, helping people without conditions, helping people before they fell completely through the cracks. The first grant went to a single mother struggling to replace a broken furnace. The second helped an elderly veteran pay for medication. Nolan personally reviewed every application. He signed every approval sitting at Walter's old desk. Each signature felt like honoring a promise. News of the station's restoration slowly spread through Cedar Ridge. People began showing up. A retired electrician offered to inspect the wiring. A plumber volunteered to replace damaged pipes. A local gardener planted flowers beside the entrance. Nobody asked for payment. Nobody wanted publicity. They simply helped. Just as Walter had. Just as Ethan and Vivian had. One Saturday morning, Nolan looked up from a stack of lumber and saw a pickup truck pulling into the station lot. Gavin Thornton stepped out. The truck bed was filled with building materials, plywood, drywall, lumber, paint. Without saying a word, Gavin began unloading. For 20 minutes, the two men worked side by side. When the truck was empty, Gavin finally spoke. "My father would have wanted me to do this." Nolan nodded. "I think so too." Gavin glanced at the station, at the repaired windows, at the fresh paint, at the life returning to the building. Then he climbed back into his truck. Before leaving, he paused. "There are some records in Walter's office you should read." Nolan frowned. "What records?" Gavin smiled slightly. "The ones that explain how many lives this station actually saved." Then he drove away. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Nolan returned to the hidden office. On the bottom shelf of a filing cabinet sat 3 dusty binders he had never opened. He pulled the first one free. As he turned the pages, his eyes widened, because for the first time he was seeing the full scope of what Walter Ashford had built. And it was far bigger than anyone in Cedar Ridge realized. The binders contained 40 years of lives. Nolan sat alone in Walter Ashford's office long after midnight, turning page after page. Each binder held records from the community fund. Not financial statements. Stories. People. Families. A woman whose medical treatment had been paid for after her husband died. A teenager who received help with college tuition after losing both parents. A family that kept their home because someone had quietly covered 3 missed mortgage payments. Every page represented a moment when somebody had almost fallen, and somebody else had caught them. By sunrise, Nolan understood something important. Walter hadn't built a fund. He had built a safety net, and almost nobody in Cedar Ridge knew how many times it had saved them. The following week, Nolan made copies. Not of private details, only the names of contributors, dates, and records showing how the fund had operated through the decades. He pinned the pages to the community bulletin board outside the courthouse. Then he waited. The response surprised him. Within days, people started arriving at Firehouse number 7. An older woman recognized her father's name among the donors. A retired teacher discovered that an anonymous scholarship she had received 30 years earlier came from Walter's fund. A mechanic learned that the emergency assistance which had saved his family's house had originated from the station. One story became 10. 10 became 50. Soon the entire town was talking about the same thing. For years they had viewed the old station as an abandoned building. Now they understood it had been something else entirely. A place where people helped one another. A place where kindness had quietly lived. The station stopped being a ruin. It became a landmark. As summer arrived, the restoration accelerated. The plumbing worked. The electrical system passed inspection. Fresh paint covered the walls. New glass filled every window frame. Flowers bloomed beside the entrance thanks to Eleanor's garden. People visited almost daily. Some came to help. Others came simply to remember. One warm Saturday morning, Nolan carried a polished brass plaque outside. Samuel helped hold it steady while he mounted it beside the main entrance. The plaque read, "In memory of Ethan and Vivian Mercer, volunteer firefighters who gave their lives saving 14 children at Riverside Elementary School. Their courage is remembered, their legacy lives on." Beneath the inscription were the names of all 14 children they had saved. Nolan had spent weeks locating the records. Every name mattered. Every life mattered. By noon, nearly 30 people had gathered outside the station. Samuel stood near the front. Gavin Thornton stood quietly in the back. The electrician, the plumber, teachers, neighbors, families whose lives had once been touched by Walter's fund, and Eleanor Ashford. She stood beside the plaque with one hand resting on her cane. Though age had bent her shoulders, her voice remained strong. Most of the crowd fell silent as she stepped forward. "Many of you knew Walter Ashford," she began. Heads nodded throughout the gathering. "But today isn't about Walter." She turned toward Nolan. "It's about a boy he never stopped looking for." The crowd followed her gaze. Nolan shifted uncomfortably. Public attention still felt strange. Eleanor smiled gently. 18 years ago, Ethan and Vivian Mercer gave their lives saving children from a burning school. The crowd listened. Their son was 6 months old. A pause. That son spent 18 years growing up without knowing where he came from. Several people lowered their eyes. He never knew his parents were heroes. Another pause. He never knew this town remembered them. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes, but somehow, after all those years, he found his way home. The crowd remained silent for a moment. Then someone began clapping. Samuel, others joined. Soon the entire gathering applauded. Not loudly, not dramatically, just sincerely. The kind of applause reserved for truth. Afterward, nobody rushed away. Children played inside the truck bay. Neighbors shared food. Old stories resurfaced. Laughter echoed through the station for the first time in years. The building felt alive. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Nolan climbed the steel ladder to the roof. The sun was setting over Cedar Ridge. Golden light stretched across rooftops and tree-lined streets. Below him, Eleanor sat near the entrance, reading a book beneath a porch light. Across the street, Samuel locked the door to his hardware store and raised a hand. Nolan waved back. The station bell hung above the entrance. Restored, polished, shining. He reached into his wallet and removed the photograph he had carried his entire life. The toddler sitting on a kitchen floor. Then he placed it beside the framed photograph of Ethan and Vivian. 3 lives. 1 story. For a long moment he looked at all 3 images together. The child. The parents. The family. At last, the station glowed warmly below. Its windows illuminated. Its doors open. Its future waiting. Walter had been right. The station had found him. Nolan leaned back and looked out across the town. Only months earlier, he had been sleeping behind buildings and counting coins. Now he had a home, a purpose, a community, and something even more valuable. He knew where he belonged. The evening breeze moved gently across the roof. Below, the open doorway spilled light onto the sidewalk. The station stood steady beneath him. Not because of brick and steel, but because of the people who had loved it, the people who had built it, the people who had protected it, and now, the person who would carry it forward. The door remained open, the lights remained on, and for the first time in his life, Nolan Mercer stopped running. He was home,